Following the Second War of the Diadochi, Antigonus emerged as the overwhelmingly dominant force in Asia, while Cassander solidified his rule in Macedon. With Antigonus's might an outright threat to all the other leaders of the Greco-Macedonian world, as demonstrated in his ousting of Seleucus from his satrapy in Babylon, a coalition formed against Antigonus, comprising Cassander, Lysimachus and Ptolemy, who had taken Seleucus as a refugee. This coalition demanded Antigonus share the spoils or prepare for war. Facing down their demands, Antigonus warned them to prepare for battle. In the war thus far, Ptolemy had lost his holdings in Syria and Palestine, but had retained control of Egypt and the islands of the Mediterranean, notably the island of Cyprus. In Europe, Cassander had established command of Macedon and central Greece as well as the Peloponnese, although the Aetolians and Epirotes continued to cause problems for him. Meanwhile, Antigonus, after capturing Tyre and not seeing Ptolemy as an immediate threat, turned his focus and area of operation to Asia Minor and Europe, leaving his son Demetrius as a rearguard against any possible Ptolemaic movement into Syria. With Antigonus in Asia Minor, Cassander's ally Asandi in Caria was unable to sufficiently ward off Ptolemaeus and Antigonus, and had been soundly defeated. Things then continued to deteriorate for Cassander, when, in 313, Antigonus had dispatched Telesphorus to the Peloponnese on a campaign to free the Greek cities, a task he completed with remarkable efficiency, leaving Cassander with no real holdings south of the Corinthian Isthmus. In northern Asia Minor and the Black Sea region, Lysimachus remained in firm control, having defeated Pausanias, a general of Antigonus, and executed him and absorbed his troops into his army. G'day and welcome back to the Research Project History. In this episode we'll be taking a look at the events of the year 312, notably with the Battle of Gaza, where Antigonus's young son Demetrius would test his mettle against the experienced campaigners Ptolemy and Seleucus. Before we jump into it, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Thanks. Coming into the spring of 312, Antigonus sent his nephew and general Ptolemaeus to reinforce his freeing of the Greek cities, having successfully cleared out Cassandrian rule from the Peloponnese in the previous year. Ptolemaeus was supplied with a force of 150 warships under the command of the admiral Medius, and a land force of 5,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Added to this were a fleet of 10 ships from the island of Rhodes, dedicated to the freeing of the cities, secured by an alliance with Antigonus. Putting to sea from Asia, Ptolemaeus crossed the Aegean to the port of Bathes in Boeotia, 60 miles or 100 kilometres north of Athens. There he received from the Boeotian League a further 2,200 infantry and a whopping 1,300 cavalry. This level of support from the Greeks showed that Antigonus's plan to turn the Greeks in his favour, with promises of restored democracy, was having its desired effect. To consolidate his force, he recalled his ships that were opposing Cassander's siege of Oreus, a further 70-odd kilometres northwest across the North Euboean Gulf, while also fortifying the city of Salganius in eastern Boeotia, a region that had been variable in its loyalties thus far in the wars of the Diadochi. With this consolidated force, Ptolemaeus hoped to take the city of Chalcis, just across the narrow straits, a mere 40 metres wide at its narrowest, from Bathes and the last remaining Cassandrian holdout on the island of Euboea. This move paid double for Ptolemaeus, as it convinced Cassander to give up his attack on Oreus and move to defend Chalcis. With Cassander and Ptolemaeus' forces keeping a close eye on each other, Antigonus decided to complicate matters further for Cassander, demonstrating the theory that it is solid military practice to give your opponents more problems to solve. He summoned Medius back to Asia with his 150 ships, which he then boarded with his armies, and set out at top speed north to Macedon. Antigonus was hoping that either he could take the Macedonian homelands for himself while it was lightly defended, or if Cassander were to rush to the defence of Macedon, then his army with Ptolemaeus would establish Antigonid dominance in central Greece. Cassander recognised Antigonus's tactics, and responded in a measured manner, leaving the south in as strong a position as he could manage, while not risking his control of Macedon, and with it control of Alexander IV and Roxanne, the sole survivors of the Argead line and nominal king of Alexander the Great's divided empire. He left his brother Pliostarchus in command at Chalcis and crossed over to the Greek mainland. After taking the city of Eporus by storm, Cassander moved on to bring the Thebans into active alliance, a people whose city he had rebuilt to the delight of the Greeks and chagrin of the Macedonians. Confirming a truce with the remaining Boeotians not allied to Ptolemaeus, Cassander left Eupolemus as general in Greece and returned to Macedon to await Antigonus's crossing. Antigonus sailed well north and landed his forces on the Propontis, now called the Sea of Marmara, where he attempted to boost his force by making an alliance with the Byzantines. Here Lysimachus intervened and urged them to remain neutral, advice to which they heeded. Not confident he had the forces required to take on Cassander, Antigonus held his position there all the way through the remainder of the year. While Cassander and Antigonus had been facing off to the north, back in central Greece things hadn't been going well for Cassander's allies. On the western coast, Apollonia and Epidamnus had been freed from their Cassandrian garrison by the Korakians, from modern Corfu. The Cassandrian garrison had been dismissed under a truce, and Apollonia had been freed in line with Antigonus's decree. But Epidamnus was handed over to Glaucius, king of the Illyrians, who was an erstwhile ally of Cassander, following his defeat to him back in the summer of 314. To the east in Chalcis, with the majority of the army having departed with Cassander, his brother Pliostarchus was unable to hold out against Ptolemaeus, and the city was overtaken by Antigonus's nephew, who followed his uncle's orders and left the city free from a garrison. From there he moved west to Oporus, which Cassander had just taken over, and returned control of it to the Boeotians, while also taking the Cassandrian garrison captive. After this, he moved south into Attica, where Demetrius of Phaleum held control of Athens. For some time the Athenian citizenry had been secretly messaging Antigonus, hoping he would aid them in regaining their independence. Seeing Ptolemaeus enter their region, they revolted against Demetrius and forced him to come to terms with Ptolemaeus and request an alliance with Antigonus. Ptolemaeus, leaving Attica, marched back north into Boeotia and seized the Cadmea. He drove out the garrison and liberated Thebes. Following this, he advanced into Phocis, where he won over most of the cities and expelled Cassander's garrisons. He also marched against Locris, as they supported Cassander. He began a siege and launched continuous attacks against them. Antigonus may have been unsuccessful in taking Macedon, but his gambit to draw Cassander away from the south had led to most of it coming under his alliance and control, and more importantly for him, removed Cassandrian forces from almost all the Greek territory. This, combined with the propaganda coup of freeing the cities, meant the campaigning year 312 was one of great success for Antigonus. In the same summer of 312, across the sea in North Africa, the people of Cyrene rebelled against Ptolemy. They took over the citadel and were about to oust the garrison from its post, when envoys from Alexandria tried to calm them down. But the rebels ignored the message, killed the messengers, and kept attacking the citadel with even more force. Enraged by this action, Ptolemy sent Agis as his general with a large army, and a fleet under Epinetus to assist. Agis led the attack and quickly captured the city. He punished the rebels for their rebellion by binding them and sending them to Alexandria. After arranging matters in the city as best he could, Agis returned to Egypt. This immediate issue dealt with, Ptolemy crossed over from Egypt to Cyprus, with his army to fight against the kings who refused to remain in his alliance, having been seduced to side with Antigonus. Arriving in Cyprus, he found Pygmalion was in negotiation with Antigonus, so Ptolemy simplified matters and had him executed. He also arrested Praxippus, the king of Lapithia and ruler of Cyrene, on suspicion that Praxippus might be against him, and he arrested Stasochius, the king of Marion, and destroyed the city, taking the people to Paphos. Having subdued his opponents, Ptolemy appointed Nicocrenon as general over Cyprus, handing to him all the cities and wealth of the kings who had been turfed out. Ptolemy then sailed to Upper Syria, which, with Antigonus no longer in the region, was right for Ptolemy to reinsert his influence in. He captured and sacked Pisidium at the mouth of the Orontes River, and Potamicanon, an unknown location in the region. He then sailed to Cilicia and took Malus, selling the people there as slaves. He also plundered the nearby area, and after filling his army with loot, sailed back to Cyprus. Diodorus concludes that Ptolemy was trying to make his soldiers excited about the battles that were coming their way by showing off his power and showering them with wealth. To the east in Syria, Demetrius the son of Antigonus had been placed as a rearguard to ward off any attempt by Ptolemy to expand his holdings northeast out of Egypt. Although currently holding the territory reasonably securely, Ptolemy's superior fleet enabled him to move out of Egypt and raid the coastlands, distracting and testing the young general. From Syria, Demetrius heard about Ptolemy having raided Cilicia and capturing cities around Malus, took it upon himself to rectify the situation. Leaving Python as general in command in Syria, with his elephants and heavily armed units, Demetrius raced with the cavalry and light armed units, and raced for Cilicia. In only 6 days he reached the region, only to find that Ptolemy had upped and left back to Cyprus with his booty. Not only was this trip to no avail, but the speed of his march also took a great toll on his cavalry. Diodorus records the distance travelled was 24 stages of the Persian road network, which may have been up to 640 kilometres or 400 miles, or about 100 kilometres 60 miles each day. Significantly more than the 25 to 40 kilometres, which was typical of Hellenistic-era cavalry. Meanwhile, Ptolemy, satisfied with his winnings, sailed from Cyprus back down to Egypt. Arriving in Egypt, Ptolemy found Seleucus champing at the bit to take a chance against the Antigonid alliance. Antigonus turfing him out of his satrapy in Babylon, being one of the primary causes of this entire conflict. Not one to take risks, but convinced nonetheless by Seleucus to take on Demetrius, Ptolemy gathered all the forces he could muster. He amassed a force of 18,000 foot soldiers, supported by 4,000 cavalry. Demetrius by now had returned to Syria early in the spring of 312, and recalled his men from their winter quarters, and moved south to camp near the city of Old Gaza. Demetrius had managed to gather an army of 11,000 infantry, several thousand light infantry, 4,400 cavalry, and 43 elephants. Marching out from Alexandria via Pelusium, the seasoned campaigners Ptolemy and Seleucus moved north to camp opposite their young opponent, who was about to engage in his first major clash as a leader. In his camp, Demetrius somewhat nervously mounted a platform to address his troops. Despite his anxiety, he was well received by his men, who shouted words of encouragement to him. Having issued his encouragement and promised his soldiers their share of the booty, the young general drew up his army. On the left flank, where he himself intended to fight, Demetrius placed first the 200 selected horsemen of his guard, among whom were all his other friends, and particularly Python, who had campaigned with Alexander and had been appointed by Antigonus as co-general and partner to Demetrius in the defence of Syria. As an advance guard, he drew up 3 troops of cavalry, and the same number of guards on the flank. In addition to these, and stationed separately outside the wing, he placed 3 troops of Tarentines. In total, he had a force of 500 horsemen armed with lances, and 100 Tarentines centred around him. Next to these, he placed the 800 companion cavalry, followed by just over 1,500 horsemen of various types, for a total left-wing cavalry of 2,900. In front of the entire left wing, he arrayed 30 of his elephants, filling the intervals between them with light-armed men. 1,000 were javelin throwers and archers, and 500 were Persian slingers. His intention was to determine the outcome of the battle with this strong left wing. Next to the wing, he drew up the infantry phalanx, which comprised of 11,000 men, of whom 2,000 were Macedonians, 1,000 were Lycians and Pamphylians, and 8,000 were mercenaries. Out on the right flank, he drew up his remaining 1,500 cavalrymen, under a commander named Andronicus, who was ordered to hold his line back at an angle and avoid fighting, leaving the decisive manoeuvre of the battle to Demetrius. The 13 remaining elephants he stationed in front of the infantry phalanx, with the regular complement of light troops filling the gaps. At first, Ptolemy and Seleucus had, like Demetrius, made the left flank of their army the strongest. However, upon learning of Demetrius's formation, they hurriedly reformed their army, positioning their now strengthened right wing to face Demetrius's left. On this wing, they deployed the 3,000 strongest cavalry, which they would lead. In front of this position, they placed iron chain-linked spiked devices to deter the elephants. These could have been similar to those used by Polyperchon to great effect in his defence of Megalopolis, where he had timber frames made with nails and spikes pointing, hidden in the dirt to pierce the elephant's feet, but in this case made portable by the linking chain to be able to be deployed wherever the armies clashed. Additionally, light armed units were positioned in front of the right wing, with javelinmen and archers to continuously shoot at the elephants and their riders. In his campaigns with Alexander, Seleucus had seen firsthand the fearsome destruction that an elephant charge could bring in the Battle of the Hydaspes River back in 326. Obtaining a means of countering this threat was a significant technological development for elephant warfare. Once their right wing was fortified, they drew up the rest of their army as conditions permitted, likely, though we're not given specific details, with a phalanx of up to 18,000 minus the light troops deployed in front of the right-wing cavalry, and the remaining 1,000 cavalry likely on the far left wing. With the opposing forces having met on the flat open plains to the south of Gaza, the battle quickly devolved into a messy affair, with Demetrius's advance guard charging in to take the early honours. Not deterred, Ptolemy and Seleucus drew on their experience and rallied their cavalry, drawing them up into a deep rather than a wide formation, and with spears engaged, charged into Demetrius's line. Spears on both lines shattered in both defence and attack, and many were wounded, and the Ptolemaic charge was repulsed. Once again the seasoned campaigners rallied their men for another charge, this time with swords drawn. In close combat fighting, this time around many were killed. Not discouraged by the bloodshed, and with Ptolemy, Seleucus and Demetrius all exposing themselves to danger and in the thick of the fighting, these men selected for their skill and bravery fought on, competing for their commanders' praise. The risk taken by the commanders was rational. With the fighting so intense and the casualties mounting, it would be difficult for the loser of this encounter to recover. As the cavalry bloodbath wore on, Demetrius's elephants were spurred on by their Indian drivers and entered the melee. The thunderous momentum of these vast beasts a seemingly unstoppable force. When, however, they met the contingent of javelin throwers and archers, while also encountering Ptolemy's innovative spiked barrier, things changed. As projectiles began targeting and severely wounding the elephants and those mounted on them, the drivers nonetheless tried to force their beasts forward with their goads, unwittingly driving them into the spikes laid in place just for that purpose. Tormented by their pain, and from those attacking as well as those riding them, the elephants were driven into a panicked frenzy. Succeeding in defending against the elephants, Ptolemy's men went on to shoot down all the riders and capture or kill all the elephants, nullifying Demetrius's key advantage. Seeing the panic and capture of the elephants, Demetrius's horsemen, still under attack by the Ptolemaic cavalry, in turn panicked and fled, recognising the important advantage they had lost, leaving Demetrius with but a few loyal supporters. When he begged those fleeing to stand and not desert him, his pleas fell on deaf ears, and he was forced from the field with the rest. Surprisingly, Demetrius managed to form some sort of organised retreat of the cavalry as far as Gaza, with the infantry abandoning the heaviest of their armour following. Arriving in Gaza as the sun was setting, a portion of the cavalry abandoned their leader, wanting to enter the city to get to where their baggage was stored before Ptolemy's army could plunder it. With the open city gates a choke point of confusion of cavalry and pack animals, they were unable to close them in time to prevent Ptolemy charging through and taking the city. Continuing on his retreat, Demetrius arrived at Azotus, modern Ashdod, around midnight, 50 kilometres or 30 miles from the battle. He then sent an envoy to arrange the burial of the dead, eager to honour those who had fallen with a proper funeral. Many of his friends had fallen, including Python, his co-commander, and Boetus, who had lived with his father Antigonus. In all, over 500 men, mostly heavy cavalry and men of high rank, had fallen in the battle, and more than 8,000 had been captured. Although the number of dead for the battle may not seem too high, they were drawn from the most experienced and effective of those in Demetrius's command. Ptolemy and Seleucus allowed the recovery of the dead, and returned to Demetrius the royal baggage and the belongings of the prisoners who had been attending the court. They explained that their disagreement with Antigonus was not about the captured territory, but rather his refusal to share it with his companions, and that after making a pact of friendship with Seleucus, Antigonus had taken away his satrapy of Babylonia. In other words, nothing personal, it's just business. Ptolemy sent the captured soldiers to Egypt and distributed them throughout his territory. Ptolemy having given a magnificent burial to all his own men who had died in the battle, he then marched his forces against the cities of Phoenicia, besieging some and winning others through sheer persuasion. Demetrius, his once strong army now severely depleted, sent a messenger to his father requesting immediate assistance, before moving to Tripoli in Phoenicia, and summoning whatever soldiers he could from Cilicia, and those of his other men guarding cities or strongholds who had not been involved in the battle. After gaining control of the open countryside, Ptolemy first won Sidon to his side, then camping near Tyre, he summoned Andronicus, the commander of the garrison, to surrender the city, promising a bribe of gifts and abundant honours. However, Andronicus refused to betray the trust placed in him by Antigonus and Demetrius, going on to even insult Ptolemy. His men, though, had a differing opinion, and mutinied, expelling Andronicus from the city and into Ptolemy's clutches. Andronicus expected to receive punishment for his insults and his unwillingness to surrender Tyre, but Ptolemy showed his usual restraint and did not exact revenge. Instead, he gave him gifts and kept him in his court, making him one of his friends and advancing him in honour. This tactic was one that continued to work for Ptolemy, and gave him a reputation for fairness and kindness, qualities which increased both his soft and real power, and made him a desirable ally, just as he had been to Seleucus when he fled to him. With the Antigonid faction now on the back foot in Asia, Seleucus saw his opportunity to regain his satrapy in Babylon. Requesting soldiers for an expedition to Babylonia, Ptolemy readily consented, promising to aid Seleucus in every way until he regained his satrapy. This brings us to the end of the campaigning season in late 312 for Ptolemy and Demetrius. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Antigonus's admiral Telesphorus, who had been stationed near Corinth, noticed Ptolemaeus being favoured and entrusted with all affairs throughout Greece. He accused Antigonus of leaving him out, before selling the fleet of ships that he had from Antigonus, and setting out on his own venture, using proceeds from the ships to raise a private army. Entering Elis, pretending he was still an ally of Antigonus, Telesphorus fortified the citadel and took over the city. From there he plundered the sacred site at Olympia near Elis, which was under its protection, collecting over 500 talents of silver for his troubles. With this booty, he expanded his army, hiring more mercenaries. Ptolemaeus, who had been appointed over the affairs of Greece, hearing of Telesphorus's revolt, the capture of Elis and the plundering of Olympia, marched into the Peloponnese with an army. Upon arriving in Elis, Ptolemaeus levelled the fortified citadel. He then returned the Eleans' freedom and restored the city's treasure to it. Telesphorus, recognising his defeat, gave up his holdings to the Antigonid alliance. While this was occurring in the Peloponnese, in Epirus, the Epirotes, whose previous king, Alcides, had been killed in battle with Cassander's brother Philip the previous year, passed the kingship over to an older brother of Alcides, Alcetas, another enemy of Cassander. Learning of the appointment of another anti-Cassandrian king in Epirus, Lyciscus, who had been appointed general over Acarnania by Cassander, entered Epirus with an army, hoping to easily remove Alcetas from his throne while the kingdom was still in disarray. With Lycurgus encamped near Cassiopeia, Alcetas sent his sons, Alexander and Teucer, to the cities to raise as many soldiers as possible. In the meantime, Alcetas took to the field with what force he had and approached near Lycurgus without engaging, waiting for the return of his sons. However, Lycurgus's forces were far superior in number, and the Epirotes were frightened and deserted to Lycurgus. Alcetas, deserted, fled to Eurymene, a city in Epirus. Lycurgus was besieging Alcetas there when Alexander arrived with reinforcements for his father. A fierce battle ensued, resulting in the deaths of many soldiers, including some of Lycurgus's followers, notably the general Mithicus, and Lysander, an Athenian who had been appointed to command Leucas by Cassander. Overall, Alexander was victorious in this battle. Afterwards, when Danius brought reinforcements to Lycurgus's army, another battle took place. This time the Epirotes were defeated, and fled with their father to another stronghold. Meanwhile, Lycurgus captured Eurymene, plundered it and destroyed it. At this time, Cassander, who had heard of his forces' defeat but not the subsequent victory, hurried to Epirus to assist Lycurgus. Upon discovering Lycurgus's triumph, Cassander made peace and an alliance with Alcetas. He then took a portion of his army and marched to the Adriatic to besiege Apollonia, as the city's inhabitants had expelled his garrison and joined the Illyrians. However, the Apollonian citizens remained undeterred and sought aid from their allies, forming a formidable army before the city walls. In a gruelling and prolonged battle, the superior Apollonian forces forced their adversaries to retreat. With his army depleted and the approaching winter of 312-311, Cassander realised he lacked sufficient troops and returned to Macedonia, bringing to a close the events of 312. The year 312 had been a busy one. Antigonus's manoeuvres in Greece and Macedon, coupled with Ptolemaeus' success in central Greece, had weakened Cassander's position. While Antigonus had failed to take Macedon, his strategy distracted Cassander, allowing Ptolemaeus to liberate Greek cities and expand Antigonid influence. Meanwhile, in the south, Ptolemy, having suppressed the revolt in Cyrene, continued to maintain his naval dominance of the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, moving at will against Antigonid cities in the region, while also reconfirming his control of Cyprus. Ptolemy had also taken the opportunity to expand his territorial claims out of Egypt, while Antigonus was elsewhere, successfully taking on the Young Demetrius in the Battle of Gaza. The ensuing battle, characterised by intense cavalry charges and the deployment of elephants, saw both sides suffer heavy casualties. Despite the cost, Ptolemy's forces had shown up Demetrius at Gaza and had decimated his army. Ptolemy was now the dominant force in the region. Elsewhere, Seleucus was on his way to Babylon to stake his claim on that satrapy, while messengers from Demetrius were on their way to call Antigonid reinforcements back to the east. But that's all for now, and we'll wrap up the Third War of the Diadochi next time. As always, sources are listed in the description below. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.